Today I'm going to share 3 true stories where the facts in these stories are so bizarre people today are still trying to explain them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, when the like button tries to tell you something really important, just constantly interrupt them every few seconds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 8 p.m. on April 25th, 1977, a 31-year-old man named Apolinario Sua Correa poured water on the campfire that he had built with his 3 brothers, Firmino, Oriano, and Jose, on the beach of a small uninhabited island in northeast Brazil. The island was called Crab Island, and Apolinario and his family would take their boat there all the time because they would harvest lumber that they would then sell to local construction workers. Now, when they would go out to Crab Island, pretty much every single time there was nobody else on this island. It was all theirs, but there was a specific reason for that. It was because most of their neighbors thought that Crab Island was haunted. People who visited the island would often report hearing these strange voices coming from the forest in particular at night, even though nobody lived on this island. And then sometimes people even saw lights flashing over the treetops. But Apolinario and his brothers made really good money by going out to Crab Island. And also, they just were not afraid of the stories people told. They thought they were all made up. And so today they had arrived at Crab Island during high tide, which had been at about 12 p.m. And so today they had arrived at Crab Island during high tide, which had been at about 12 p.m. And then they had spent the entire afternoon chopping down trees. But that didn't concern them because they really hadn't planned to immediately sail back home. They had planned to actually have dinner on the island after they were done working, and then maybe sleep for a few hours actually on their boat while it was out on the mud. And then while they were sleeping for a few hours, the tide would come back in again, it would raise their boat up, they would wake up, and they'd be ready to sail home at that point. And so that's what they did. They had this long day of work. They had their dinner by the campfire, and then after Ario put out the fire, he and his brothers waded into the mud over towards their boat, which was literally sitting, low tide on the mud, and they climbed on board. They walked into the main cabin. They laid down their sleeping pads, and it didn't take long for them all to fall asleep. Now, Apolinario and his brothers had only intended to sleep until about midnight, but when Apolinario woke back up again, although it was still dark in the cabin, he looked out the tiny window and he saw that the sky outside was already pink from the sunrise. And when he saw this, he groaned because he knew they had overslept and had missed high tide. Basically, their boat had gone back up and then back down into the mud. And now they were stuck again and would have to wait likely until noon to finally be able to leave. So it was just a nuisance. And so at this point, Apolinario looked over to see if his 3 brothers were still asleep. And he saw that Firmino and Jose were still asleep on their sleeping pads with their blankets pulled up over their faces. But his 3rd brother, Alrianiano, his sleeping pad was empty and he wasn't inside the cabin. And so as Apolinario is realizing, his 3rd brother is gone, doesn't know where he is, he hears this just deafening screaming coming from outside on the boat, but not inside the main cabin. And so immediately Apolinario, he jumps up, he runs outside, and he finds his 3rd brother, Araniano. And his brother was completely covered in burns. Apolinario was so horrified that he just froze, because it looked like his brother's skin had literally been set on fire. And then he noticed something even stranger about the whole thing, which was, his brother, despite being so badly burned, his clothes didn't appear burned. It was like literally just his skin, like somehow his skin had caught fire, but nothing else on him. And his brother is just screaming in agony, and Apolinario has no idea what to do. He has no idea how this even happened. And while this is happening, the sort of shocked moment, Apolinario begins to hear moaning coming from back inside the cabin where he came from. And so, just sort of acting on instinct, he ran back inside the cabin. And remember, his 2 brothers, Firmino and Jose, their blankets were up over their heads, so he hadn't seen them yet. And so he runs in. He knows the moaning is coming from one of them. And he pulls back the blankets and he sees the moaning is coming from Firmino and his skin is just horribly burned. Like his skin is literally falling off his body. But just like his other brother, his clothes didn't appear to be burned at all. It was like just his skin had been set on fire, and he's moaning in just pure agony. And then Apolinario, he looks over at his other brother, who's also on his sleeping pad, Jose, and he was not burned, but he was dead. Now, unfortunately, because of the tides, Apolinario still had to wait a full 6 hours before he could get his brothers off the island. And so they waited until the tide came in, and then finally they took off. And then when they got back to land, Aureliano, who was the one who was screaming outside the main cabin, who had, burns all over his body, he was badly hurt, but not maybe critically so. He stayed behind with Jose's body, and Apolinario wound up taking Firmino to the hospital because his injuries looked like they could be critical. When they finally got to the hospital, Firmino was like barely conscious. Like his injuries were really taking a toll on him. It was like his body was shutting down. But as soon as he was checked in, the doctors asked him like, hey, just tell us how you got these burns. Give us some indication of how this happened. And right before Firmino slipped into a coma from his burns, he was able to tell them that when he and his brothers were still out at Crab Island, he had looked out the window from inside the cabin of his boat when they were all sleeping in the boat, and outside there was this inexplicable ball of fire hovering in the air, and that's all he remembered. He had no idea how he actually got burned. So the police opened an investigation into whatever happened that night at Crab Island, and they would come up with several theories that, maybe could explain it, including that maybe the men had simply injured each other and were just sort of lying about it. Maybe they had taken drugs or were under the influence of something, and, while being that way, they could have hurt themselves or each other, or just something could have happened that they didn't remember. Or another theory was maybe lightning struck the beach and somehow reflected off the sand, and bolts of lightning made their way out into the boat and, burned two and killed one. But the reality is these theories, there was no evidence to support any of them. In fact, the big takeaway from this investigation is basically that when they went out to that island, they found nothing. There was just no evidence whatsoever. Ultimately, the two injured surviving brothers, Firmino and Aureliano, they would make full recoveries, but neither of them ever could remember any meaningful details of what happened. And so eventually, the case was closed without really any answers, but strange stories continued to come from Crab Island. People continued to hear voices and see strange lights. And then finally in April of 1986, so 9 years after the death of Jose, a different crew of 4 men traveled out to Crab Island to harvest timber. And at some point they all recalled hearing this loud crashing sound out in the woods. And then they all just fell unconscious. And when they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. One of them was dead and another one was inexplicably covered in burns. And just like the brothers 9 years earlier, the survivors of this incident had no memory of what happened. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now, and it just feels different, busier, and more complicated. I mean, there are moments I think about, sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important, but now looking back, I think I tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring, because they don't last forever. And so someday the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/EmmerBBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the night of June 12, 1993, 69-year-old D. Slayton climbed into bed in his home in League City, Texas. And even this small action, getting in bed, took a lot of effort for D because he was very... And even this small action, getting in bed took a lot of effort for D because he was very, very sick. So D had a brain tumor. He'd actually been diagnosed the year before, but had then quickly gone into remission. So he thought he'd beaten it. But it had unfortunately come back a few months later, and this time it was much worse. D knew eventually this thing was going to kill him, and unfortunately, probably sooner than later, his wife and daughter had been taking care of him as he got weaker and sicker. And while he certainly appreciated it, the reality was it really bothered him. I mean, he was a tough guy, and he was used to being the person who took care of other people, not the other way around. But more than that, the worst part of him getting sick was he hadn't been able to fly a plane in months. So Dee was like a legend in the aviation community. And Dee had loved being up high and looking down at the... As a young man, he'd been in the Air Force and he'd flown in World War II combat missions, some of the most harrowing aerial combat in recorded history. And Dee had loved being up high and looking down at the world from his cockpit so much that after the war was over, he'd gone one step further to space. And he had not just become a regular astronaut, he'd been on NASA's first team of astronauts to literally ever go to space. And then after he had gotten too old for space trips, he continued to work for NASA in various capacities until his retirement 10 years ago. But retiring had not meant he just stopped, aerial travel completely. I mean, he was done flying into space, but he still flew planes. In fact, he was a hugely successful amateur air racer, which is a competitive sport where aircraft race one another through basically an aerial obstacle course. And so now, as Dee's life was sort of slipping through his fingers, all he found himself wanting to do was just go fly. He had this plane called a Stinger, which he used for racing. It was this red small plane that was super loud, pretty unique, but he loved this plane and he just constantly fantasized about getting back in the cockpit and going for a ride. However, Dee did know that because of his tumor, realistically him flying a plane would not be safe. His speech was shaky and he was tired all the time. Also, like his balance and decision were affected. And then on top of the physical limitations from his tumor, also there was the reality that his Stinger plane was currently in storage. But as Dee laid in bed that night feeling just physically awful and, literally feeling his life sort of slipping away, all he wanted was just one more time to fly. And it just became so overpowering, that desire to fly again, that he decided while he was laying there that tomorrow, first thing in the morning, whether I am sick or not, I am getting up. I am taking my Stinger out of storage and I am going for a ride. Early the next morning at the John Wayne Airport in Southern California, which was over 1,500 miles away from where Dee lived, an airport manager stepped into his office ready to start his shift. He worked for the airport's noise abatement department, which was responsible for making sure that the planes that flew in and out didn't make too much noise and drive the neighbors crazy. And usually this early in the morning, things were pretty calm and uneventful. But today, as soon as the manager got into his office, he heard his desk phone ring. And when he answered it, the person on the other end said they were a local resident and they wanted to make a complaint. There had just been a plane flying low over her house, making a ton of noise. The manager immediately looked over at the clock and saw it was just before 8 a.m., which meant that the plane that this resident was complaining about was in violation of the airport's curfew. John Wayne Airport had a policy where they didn't let any planes take off before 8 a.m. on Sundays, specifically to avoid this, to avoid bothering the locals too early. And so on the phone, this, perturbed resident gave a description of the aircraft, which was a small red racing Stinger. And so the manager took some notes, hung up, and was about to, start making some phone calls when their phone rang again. And it was another resident with basically the exact same complaint. And then after that, this manager got more and more calls all about this red plane. And all the people who were complaining basically said they had heard it, they had seen it. It was like doing these crazy aerial maneuvers, but now it was gone. So they were calling sort of after the fact. It's gone now, but it was really, really disruptive. Some of the callers actually said that at certain points, this plane, when they saw it, had flown solo. They were able to read its identification number and they had written it down to report it. And so they told the manager that it was N21X. That was the number on this plane. And so at some point when the manager had a chance, in between all these calls they were getting, they looked up on their computer to see who this plane was registered to, using that number N21X. And when they saw whose plane this was, the manager was shocked. This was Dee Slayton's plane. The manager knew Deke. I mean, everybody did. And when the manager saw the readings, he could see very clearly that at least 3 monitors had gone way up at the same time. The residents all said they saw Deke's plane. And it was very surprising to him that somebody like Dee, who was a consummate professional, would be flying around so recklessly outside of curfew. I mean, that's crazy. So on his computer, the manager pulled up the morning's readings from the airport's noise monitors. And when the manager saw the readings, he could see very clearly that at least 3 monitors had gone way up at the same time the residents all said they saw Deke's plane. And so at this point, The manager knew that because of these noise recordings, which corroborated the reports, that he would have to send, the legend himself, D, a formal note about doing this. I mean, he was basically going to have to reprimand D. However, based on all the reports and also on those monitors which measured the noise in the area, it seemed apparent that D, whatever he was doing, he was done doing it now because he was out of the airspace. And so, this manager would have to reprimand him, but there wasn't a huge urgency, but he would have to do it eventually. So the manager printed out the noise recordings, put them on his stack of things to do, and then just went about his day. 15 days later, that manager finally got around to actually sending that warning to D. And when Deke's wife got that letter and read its contents, she was so confused because what this airport was claiming D did was literally impossible. It would turn out there was literally no way D. Slayton could have been flying his Stinger over the California skies on that day, because the storage location that was holding Deke's plane was actually a museum in Nevada. He'd given the Stinger to them 3 years ago, and it hadn't moved since. And just to make it clear here, they had removed the engine from the Stinger and then hung the Stinger from the rafters in this museum. Like, this thing is not flyable, at least not quickly. But more than the logistics of how quickly could he get the plane out of the museum, put the engine back in, and make it fly ready. Beyond that, that's a huge problem. But the other far bigger reason that it was truly impossible that D was the one flying that plane, even though clearly it was his plane, the tail number said as much. The reason it couldn't have been him is because 5 full hours before that recorded flight, D had passed away in his sleep. No one has ever been able to explain how D's red Stinger plane ended up over the skies of California that morning. It just doesn't make any sense. And today, that warning letter that the manager from the John Wayne Airport sent to D, that ultimately his wife got and was so confused by, that letter actually sits on display at the D. Slayton Memorial Space Museum. He just kept on running as fast as he could until he got to the cafeteria. One morning in June of 1972, a hospital administrator named Harold Michaels ran down the hallway of the Alhama Hospital in California. He was totally out of breath. He was going as fast as he could, and as he turned the corner, he nearly knocked over a gurney, but he didn't even stop to apologize to the person who was pushing it. He just kept on running as fast as he could until he got to the cafeteria where all the nurses and doctors were eating before they started their morning shift. And as soon as he got in there, totally out of breath, he just yelled out to everybody to, "Hey, pay attention! I have a very important announcement." And so immediately, the room goes silent. All the staff, they turned to look to see what's going on here. And all he said was, "The hospital needs to update its disaster plan." But as Harold paused for a second, like a normal day at the hospital, but here Harold was acting like there was some disaster at hand. To catch his breath and let this information sort of be soaked in by the audience, he looked around and he saw pretty much everybody was looking back at him with just looks of total confusion on their face. And Harold definitely understood why they might react that way, because there really was no clear reason for Harold to be suddenly barging in here and demanding they update this plan. There hadn't been any recent mass casualty events or, natural disasters or anything. This was just like a normal day at the hospital, but here, Harold was acting like there was some disaster at hand. And so there was this moment of wait, are you serious? What's going on here? But before anybody could really ask any questions, he just said, "Look, I want to make sure we are capable of handling a mass casualty event, an emergency. We need to have a better plan in place in case something really terrible happens.